So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Cerra, bonjour, and I have the pleasure to moderate this panel entitled Designing Tools and Workflows by and for Researchers. Our first speakers this afternoon are Luca, Federico, Cerra, and Takats from Université de Luxembourg. So Luca Federico Cerra is a doctoral researcher in modern history at the C2DH. He's writing a thesis in co-tutel with the University of Namur on the causes and consequences of the abolition of guilds in Luxembourg at the end of the 20th century. 18th century, that's my... specialized in economic and social history, as well as the history of emotions and mentalities. He is also involved in the DHARPA Digital Humanities project, and is a member at the RR cluster. Takats leads the Digital History Advanced Research Project Accelerator, so the DHARPA, at the Centre Luxembourgeois d'Histoire Contemporaine et Numérique, so C2DH. He's currently Professor of History and FNRPL Chair at the University of Luxembourg. Previously, he was Associate Professor at George Mason University and Director of Research at the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media. So their presentation today is entitled Two Historians' Relationships with Sources in the Digital Age.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you, Clarice, and to the other organizers for inviting Luca and me to this conference today. I feel very lucky to be going last or nearly last in the conference because we've had a chance to hear so much from the rest of you. It kind of helps us cheat a little bit. So thanks for the presentations you've given so far. You can see that our title looks like something from Lauren's presentation, like a bad sitcom title. To historians, and our presentation will be a bit like a two-hander, like we're going to kind of go back and forth, the two of us here. But I think that's actually a good way to frame the project and what we'll be talking about today. So many of the projects here started with a nice screenshot of, the whole team involved and so on, and we actually don't have a screenshot like that. Most of the photos of our team are like at a restaurant with champagne or something. It's not really appropriate for a conference, but I'll tell you a bit about our team. So since 2020 in Luxembourg, our research team, Luca and I are part of, which today is around 10 software developers and early career researchers, we've been engaged in the design and development of a new platform for humanities data analysis. Under this project umbrella, DARPA, which those of you who are like an idea of like American, like military industrial complex, deep state, like it's a bad acronym. They made us make an acronym as a European project, and so I intentionally chose one that I didn't like, or I thought was funny, but now we're stuck with it. So under this umbrella, DARPA, we've built a team of early career researchers and software developers to experiment in new ways to create, annotate, and visualize humanities data, and that's why we're here today. Although I think our project, I felt like an outsider a lot the last 2 days because we don't really do video. We definitely don't do theater, although I used to do some research on 18th century theater. Anyway, before we dive into our project, I wanted to take a really quick, brief detour to talk about annotation in general. And this is the advantage, again, of going last, because I've got to hear a lot about what all of you said about annotation the last few days. But I haven't heard a lot of like introspection about like why we annotate or what an annotation is. And I don't think that's like, I'm not like saying something bad about you. I think it's because I suspect a lot of you have a shared understanding of what annotations are and what they should look like. So here are some of the questions that like come up all the time, not just in my own mind and our minds, but also like in the literature about annotations. Like, are annotations private or are they public? Like, are they like just for you or are they to be shared? Are they made just by you or are they made as part of a team? Do they get edited later? Are they ephemeral? Are they something you just are like using like as you're like writing a margin note in a book, to use like an analog example, that you're probably never going to read again, but it's like an aide-memoire, like it makes you think of something? Or is it durable, something you're meant to come back to later? Is it something that apes and like mimics an analog annotation, Or is it something that tries to reinvent it as something different? There's a lot of discussion in annotation, like, are you meant to try to just like reinvent the wheel here? Do annotations have a semantic link to the underlying sources? Like, this is the, I think, traditional understanding of an annotation, like it has something linked to the thing under consideration. Or is it linked to a research question? Like, is it something at a meta level? Are you talking about like a problem you're trying to solve, and that's what you want to annotate? Or is it some mixture of both? When does annotation happen? Does it happen like before you do something? Does it happen like while you're doing something? Does it happen like retrospectively, something in the past? So there are all kinds of questions about annotation that we've spent a lot of time trying to figure out. So DHARPA continues in the spirit of my team's other projects. You can see some of them here. There's annotations from Tropi there and from Zotero, which give researchers new ways to annotate texts and images. These our earlier projects, well, I guess they're not, they still are happening, but they are basically focused on sources, right? And our title says sources, but really DHARPA is more interested in annotating methods. And so annotation really is at the heart of our activities. Our approach to annotation differs, I think, from a lot of the other interests in digital humanities, and I think in most of what I've seen the last couple of days, where you really are focused on the annotation of the underlying media itself. I think this kind of annotation is also usually lumped in, like with annotation that is publicly shareable in some way, often written in collaboration. So I see a lot of these different categories that I started with kind of getting lumped together. And I'm not claiming that I invented these distinctions. This is just, we are just one of the only kind of attempts to like look at this in a bigger way. One way that we think we can address annotation and make ourselves this kind of like expert inside the machine, which is like the goal of DHARPA, is through annotation, by like leaving traces of our own presence in the production of humanities data, whether that's in the original creation, which is sometimes called like onboarding, data cleaning, which are all like bullshit ways to cover up that you're making something new, or through the accretion of layers of annotation which seek to add signal or subtract noise through actions like filtering and visualization. And even signal and noise kind of pretends like there's something there that really you're making. So in this paper, we're going to get going here in a second. We're going to show you two case studies, one really quick, mine, and one more sustained, Luca's, which explore the risks that we see inherent in digital humanities workflows and suggest avenues for transforming these risks into something good, into better tool design, basically. So along the way, we're going to talk a little bit about Kiara, which is our software backend as part of the DHARPA project. That's our new platform from data analysis, which is ultimately built around the concept of annotation. So let me turn it over to Luca. Oh, wait, not yet. So my case study first, sorry. Soon, Luca's case study. Me first, because I'm the quick one. So my case study. So my case study takes us all the way back to 2010, when I started doing research involving France's colonial archives in Aix-en-Provence. So at the time, I lived like on the other side of the planet. So beyond the like first few weeks that I was able to work on site, most of my research was going to have to be done remotely. I was working with an archive that had like 19,000 dossiers, like linear, not quite linear kilometers, but linear meters. Around this time, I also began to learn about IPython, which became Jupyter, and I had this idea to like start trying to extract metadata from the finding aids that were available and to create my own finding aid to figure out what I was doing with research. My goal was to figure out something about like tropical medicine, like what did early tropical medicine look like in the 18th century? Like where was knowledge being created? How were ideas moving around? This is all getting complicated. And I thought I could at least have an idea of where to start reading these 19,000 dossiers if I could process them in some technical way. A few years later, in a venue not unlike this, I presented a few of the data visualizations that I had made, and it was a disaster. So here's what happened. So although I had done my analysis in Jupyter notebooks, they're called notebooks, right? I didn't really use them as notebooks like you're supposed to. I looked back recently at one of the notebooks I use, and of the 10 cells in my so-called network analysis geolocate doctors notebook, there's like nothing but code in there, which I know is all like copy and pasted from Stack Overflow and other places that I was gluing together. And most alarming probably is like a comment that just says, export graph to Gephi for prettifying, like whatever that means. And then whatever I did in Gephi, of course, like that's completely lost to time. So that's just kind of like the setup. Here's what my prettified graphs look like. Here's one, medical places, like I'm putting scare air quotes around those because there's leaks of logic there. What happened is I went ahead and started presenting some of this to at a traditional academic conference of French colonial historians. And while I was delivering the paper, like I saw faces that didn't have looks on them like your faces have. Like I saw faces that were like treating this like this is it. Like this was like dispositive evidence of what was happening in 18th century France and its colonies. And I understood that like what was happening was that these were understood to be like proof of something. And so all of you, or most of you probably know like Joanna Drucker say in her work, and she says great things like most information visualizations are acts of interpretation masquerading as presentation. Like, well, that's exactly like what this was. So this moment was basically like when I decided that I needed to try something different for annotating research for my own use so I could remember what I was doing, but also to communicate that to outside researchers so that they wouldn't be duped into thinking that this was something more than what it was. So that's my quick case study. Now Luca can give you something a little bit more interesting, probably.
Yeah. Thank you, Sean. So in this part of the presentation, I will illustrate my research, including the factual limitation I encounter. I will then present the archive collection I'm working on and the way I use some software, such as Gephi, for analyzing a network of interaction between 18th century craftsmen. And finally, I will conclude by three advantages that the Kiara software could enable me to obtain. But first, my research concerned the study of connection between craftsmen under the Ancien Régime in the troubled context of the abolition of the guilds in the so-called Départements Réunis, which roughly are the present-day Benelux, as you can see it on the map. I ask myself how craftsmen lived through this period, and more specifically, I'm interested in the notion of creating social bonds, such as trust between them. How did they trust each other in a new economic situation, a new economic context? I use the term new economic context because between 1795 and 1815, the French law abolishing guilds were applied in these new territories, who were attached to France, and this completely overturned the organization of craft work. In this region, it was still largely controlled by guilds, and you see here a printing of the Cooper of Luxembourg. Guilds were urban self-managed economic association under the public law of the Ancien Régime, who established a collective discipline for the members in order to exercise a profession in which they had a monopoly. It is therefore reasonable to ask ourselves how craftsmen reacted to this sudden and unexpected change, how they behaved, how they experienced it, and more generally, how can we find traces of these feelings? In the example we are looking at here, the answer to this question came from the study of the archives of the Biens Nationaux. My research analyzed the sources produced by the abolition of guilds in the whole Luxembourg. It was known as the Département des Forêts. You can see the little arrow pointing at it. And in this special case, I will only focus on the city, the very small city of Arlon. This holds relevant archives for this period, produced either by the craftsmen themselves or by the French administration, who confiscated their goods as required by law and sold them. And this is called the auction sale of the Biens Nationaux, and you have an example of an auction sale just in the last part of the slide. The archives of this sale reveal a series of interaction between individuals. There are, of course, the buyer and his property interaction, but there is also the neighbor relationship and the so-called buyer on command. The buyer on command acts on behalf of someone else. It does not become the owner of the property, but proceed with the purchase of order of the good in order to avoid exposing the real buyer, who may wish to remain anonymous or simply is reluctant to attend the auction. This indicates a professional relationships, if the buyer on command is a notary or a lawyer, for example, or even a more intimate one, such a relative, a parent, someone who is close, and so someone the real buyer trusts. Tracking buyer sur command link, I can identify traces of trust and hypothesize why they could be well-known lawyers in the city, or they could be friends, relative, as just say, and this is something that prosopography can help me find out. These are the different steps of my research, starting with the archives and ending with the creation of a network of links between the craftsmen mentioned before and the sources. To keep a track of this research project, I annotate the reference of the archives, who has previously been digitized and numbered, of course, in a supplementary column Excel. And the final result looks like this. The first result showed the increased importance of a certain lawyer, and in the context of the town of Arlon, we are always speaking of one only town. A striking example is the one of Jean-Baptiste Gillet, who is a notary, involved in the purchase on command of a third of the confiscated and sold good. And here is a more close connection to Jean-Baptiste Gillet. This case brings up a deeper question. That I will connect with the perspective of using Kiara in a minute, is what do we actually mean by trust? In the case of a real estate transaction, presented here as a link between a buyer and a notary, starting from which amount of links can we start saying, yes, this person is a trusted person? If one edge isn't enough to express the reliability of an acheteur sur commande, probably the minimum level of edge in a graph to qualify the interaction of trust that I will choose here is 3, especially in a context like this of a very limited number of interaction. Jean-Baptiste Gillet bought on command 3 out of 9 goods, and one of them wasn't for only one buyer, but for 7 buyers associated. And it was the biggest, the larger property mentioned in the archives. It was a tannery. And it clearly shows him as the most trusted person in this transaction. In this context, Kiara could be used to keep a track of the arbitrary decision I just made about 3 edges, focusing on the path the researcher has followed to obtain result. For the sake of transparency, of course, but also to adapt to future research. For example, in a different context than the small town of Arlon, with more buyers and more property sold, the limit of 3 connection may not be relevant and may have to evolve, possibly including other factors. This brings me to the first perspective of visualizing the research workflow and adding annotation directly on it. I will use Kiara for. For example, I could produce a whole data lineage for a network graph that would go from the original Excel file, including the creation of new columns and all the choices made to refine the network graph, ending with the graph itself. This, of course, to keep a track of the decision made, such as the number of edges per person I just mentioned, the information added about the person. We can add the age of the person, the address, the marital status, and so on and so forth. And also the geographical referencing of this person or eventually of the property. This last option is particularly interesting for the goods and the property, such as meadow, chapel, factory, like the tannery. Some of them already been georeferenced by the software QGIS and, by the way, published at the Bulletin de l'Institut archéologique du Luxembourg. So there are 2 last perspective I would like to mention to finish this part of the presentation. A second perspective which is close to this first one is the metadata augmentation that would enable me to enrich my annotation with additional contextual information, extracting metadata such as dates, location, keywords from archival documents and supplementing them with manually created metadata, such as descriptive tag and annotation. And the third and last way Kiara could affect this research in a positive way, it's by its customization for research flexibility. Kiara customizable and extensible nature allows to adapt the annotation process to the evolving requirement of the research project, customizing an annotation pipeline, integrating additional functionalities, and the interfaces with other tools and other platforms.
So thanks, Luca, for that. That's probably not the kind of talk you were expecting to hear today. It's a bit different from the other ones that we've seen so far. But I'm really glad that Delfina, I think it was Delfina, brought up the God trick this morning and mentioned that because this God trick, this problem which plagues data analysis, is something that we have basically been trying to avoid from day one. I think that one of our first pieces we wrote introducing our project a few years ago opens with this question. We've been trying to develop DARPA and the Kiara software in a way that explicitly is designed to avoid this God trick where software design would remain separated from the context of everything else, separated from the humans, the institutions, the research culture that was involved in creating that data in the first place. We are totally committed to the idea that the software that we make is entirely linked to context. And in fact, it's our very personal and selfish context, which maybe will be yours too. It'll meet our needs. Maybe it'll be your needs. Who knows? We hope so. It's worked for the other stuff that we've been developing. But just to be clear, our software is not designed by committee, and it's not designed to meet sort of generic technical specifications that we develop, but to our specific user needs, which is why we show these case studies to kind of give you a sense of where it comes from. These experiences with research directly shaped the production of our lab software, Kiara. In the case of my work, the need for traceability that I saw inspired the original project proposal that funded this work. And in the case of Luca's work, we built a team specifically with early career researchers, like PhD students, whose sources and methods we could trace and model. Like Luca did not come to us as like a fully formed digital historian at all, and that's great, that's perfect. As I mentioned before, we've been preoccupied with questions about how annotation works. Things like, when do you annotate? Why should you annotate? How do you encourage annotation? But we should always remember that none of this really matters if you cannot develop something that's actually used by researchers, like that they actually want to use and they will use. We know deep in our hearts that we are resistant to adopting even relatively simple digital annotation tools. And we also know empirically, because there are good studies about how people are reluctant to adopt simple annotation tools. Even when humanities researchers are given something that is designed to be easy to use and given guidance, they still won't use it, even though annotation is supposedly on some fundamental level a core activity of humanities research. And then, of course, when you read into the literature on annotation, efforts to establish more generalizable annotation practices like code books, these kinds of things, like these are almost absurdly demanding and complicated for what humanities people actually do. So how do we solve that, or how have we tried to solve that? One potential solution, which actually a lot of projects have mentioned already, is some kind of automated annotation, like having some kind of non-human in the loop helping with annotation. Now, this is an imperfect solution, but it partly solves the problem of researchers not seeing any value in annotating what they're doing, seeing the value in investing time. I think we've seen there are examples of annotation, trying to do keyword searches, what you've already done, and try to dump stuff in. That's another way to do it in an automated, maybe more appealing, less disruptive manner. By doing some kind of automated annotation on our end, this enables us to register and track sources in Kiara. So as you're adding data, annotating it, changing it, performing operations on it, we can register those changes to track sources. We can register and track visualizations, code use results, and record metadata around those activities. So what you see here is some of our very early data lineage. So this is taking that data I was showing before about like making a finding aid of 18th century colonial medical practitioners. This is actually the same work happening in Kiara. Something really exciting, like basically like taking a CSV and changing the titles of some columns. Which maybe you think is like not an activity worth recording, but actually it's a really important activity. Like why did you rename a column and how did you name it? So we struggled for a long time, though, how to transform this into like a non-automated annotation interface. Like about when and where annotation should happen, this question, like not just in the sort of user interface, but also in like the lived experience or meat space of a researcher, like where does this actually happen? And we actually didn't come up with a good solution, and this was really helpful for us, like basically like delaying and failing to come to a solution really worked out for us because in the end, this failure to come to agreement in our team and like design something in the abstract allowed us to accidentally discover, or serendipitously maybe, a better solution, which is that when we started actually trying to visualize those lineages that I was showing a moment ago that were just in text, we realized that this automated annotation unexpectedly provides a really interesting interface for researchers to do their own deliberate annotation. So because DARPA and Kiara handle data orchestration natively, this provides access points to understand our own analysis and where we might want to add further information. Like, for example, why did I rename those columns? Like, and why did I use Dublin Core metadata labels for those titles or those columns, or did I just call it title? And what was the reasoning behind filtering a data set? Why did I set a minimum number of edges, or so on? I was super excited, I'm going to wrap this up because I know we're running out of time. I was super excited to see the scene demos, especially the workshop on the first day. In particular, what you showed using network graphs and how you were like shoehorning those into Mirador. And like, I think that kind of like, it's very dangerous what you're doing, but it's good. It's the dangerous art of a Mirador. And I think like what you can do here is like think of like, ways that those can be further annotated and how we can find further common ground for further discussions along those lines of thinking about, I mean, obviously network graph is not the same as a workflow graph, but this is kind of like a network graph, and like thinking about how you can layer annotations on top of those. And I don't want to get into this situation where it's like turtles all the way down, annotations all the way down, but I do think the annotation model, like thinking about it as all we do as researchers is adding kind of levels of annotation and layers of interpretation, is really helpful for thinking about user interface design too. Because it finds this, I saw this common ground immediately between what you're doing and what we're doing, even though we have extremely different research objectives. Anyways, I'll stop it there. I hope there's time for questions. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much. So first question, Emmanuel.
Thanks a lot for this nice update about the project. I was wondering about DARPA. In reality, it will be a library that allows you to work computationally and functioning like a glue to put together various algorithms in network analysis, for example, topic modeling and etc. But adding a kind of metadata layer to record all the operation, as the notebook usually do, but visually, then it will be encoded in the result, or like metadata linked to your content?
Yeah, so basically this, if I understand the question correctly, how Kiara works, basically, how it works, you want to know? Basically, in a nutshell. So it's Python-based, and basically what we're, sorry, our people, but it's the idea is that you basically write modules in Kiara. Kiara provides a framework for writing modules, and those modules then can be chained together into pipelines, and then there are ways to basically produce the data lineages that we just described, to produce a data export format that includes all of that data. And that kind of traceability that you described, like that's the kind of whole point of it for the sort of aide-memoire, like for the researchers and also for sharing. But it also, another example of the kind of unexpected benefits of this or potentials of this is when we presented this at some workshops last summer, we got some unexpected feedback from the audience that this would be super useful also for like grant applications, like when you're talking about a sustainability plan, data management plan, if you can basically encapsulate this in some kind of end-to-end format, that's useful too.
So I have Oyvind online who presented the Compact project earlier this morning, who wanted to discuss a bit more in depth what are annotations. And he was wondering if an image, a video, or a 3D model could be an annotation, or multimodal documents including those, and how important the notation aspect of annotations is.
Yeah, so thanks for that question. So our annotations right now, our specification for the annotation is very dumb. It's just Markdown, that's it. So we're talking about purely textual annotations. Annotations we're only talking about, in the context of Kiara, we're talking about annotating basically nodes in that research workflow. So there's nothing in Kiara specifically that's about annotating multimodal media. So I don't know why we're here, but the other underlying work, of course, like Tropy annotates images, Zotero annotates anything, so yeah.
Maybe one last question?
I know this is maybe part of the project, but how do you plan to release Kiara for the researchers? Because right now it's on GitHub and you have to tweak it. So same questions that you asked me. What about the design and the interface?
Yeah, no, this is a hard question. And so like one of the things that we spent a lot of time trying to specify and re-specifying, and in some, this is really like a moving target, is what our audience is. So early in the project, we had, I think, an overly ambitious goal to produce something that was really geared at like naive researchers, like digitally naive researchers. And since then, and of course you know this, Clarice, because you're on our scientific advisory board, but since then our focus has shifted, moved more towards the people who have some coding experience. So right now, as it stands, it's Python software you have to download and install. And that's not great. And we don't have a good solution to that. As you know, also, we had in a very early iteration, we had like a bundled Electron app that downloaded and installed the whole environment. But this was really difficult to build, and we could see quickly that the carrying costs of that were crippling. Like we could not sustain that, even with a big budget. So I think we are basically now really geared at people in this room, and not people like the people in this room, rather, and not, you know, the average person you're going to find like in your humanities department, unfortunately.
Thank you very much.
Sorry.
Thank you, both of you. And congratulations.